It's how can we get the gut to tolerate more volume, more fluid, and absorb more carbohydrate without the GI distress that so many people unfortunately experience in the endurance space. The last thing we want is for you to be like bloated and constipated and just not feeling well, as that can happen if you increase carbs too fast, increase fiber too fast. I've had people, just come to me after having increased protein really quickly because of all the protein craziness going on right now. And they're like, oh, I suddenly need so much protein. So if someone is coming to me and they're not eating anything before working out, I'm not going to be like, great, yeah, let's go straight to doing like 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate. Like, no, like maybe, especially if they're a little scared or they've had GI issues or something, like maybe we're starting with, they're having a little sports drink, they're having a bite of a banana, they're having a graham cracker. Like we might start really small, but we're trying to be consistent.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. I want to thank all my listeners for taking the time to check out my podcast. As a way to thank you, I am raffling off a free 30-minute consultation for anyone who shares an episode or leaves a review on your preferred platform. Just tag me or send me a screenshot and I will enter you in the monthly raffle. The winner for the January raffle was Sebastian Favreau. Sebastian, I'll reach out with you with details to sign up for your consultation. If you want to contact me, check out my coaching services or access additional podcast resources, including joining the show's Patreon page, please head over to zachbitter.com or send me an email at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio ProBlend, and Training Peaks for being annual partners of the HPO podcast. Discounts include 20% off Training Peaks Premium and can be accessed with promo code HPOPod at trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. 20% off ProBio ProBlend can be accessed at probionutrition.com/endurance or with promo code endurance. 20% off Delta G Ketones at deltagketones.com with promo code BITTER20 and a free sample pack with purchase at drinklmnt.com/HPO. All links and promo code discounts can be found in the show notes. All right, Claire. Well, thanks for taking some time to come on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat a bit about kind of the role of carbohydrate in terms of performance, as well as maybe some things that maybe influence that, because I think it's a topic that's just kind of grown on a lot of momentum, especially, I shouldn't say especially, just in general, but in the ultra running world. I think we've learned a lot about how to properly implement it and gain some better strategies, perhaps, compared to some of the guesswork that we were maybe doing earlier on in this most recent growth spurt with ultra marathon running. But I'm really excited to have you on and kind of chat about all that.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, you were recently on my show and we talked all about carbs there as well. So continue the conversation.
Yeah, hopefully this one will pair really nicely for that, for a bit of a turning of the chair, so to speak. And I can ask you some questions. And then if people want to listen to both of them, they can get an idea of like my kind of experience with trying high carbohydrate now for, I think I'd have to go back and look at the actual start date, but I'm probably a good 8 months into it at this point. But one thing I was really interested in kind of early on in that process was the whole digestion side of things, in terms of just getting your body ready to intake higher amounts of carbohydrate during training and racing sessions. And that became kind of clear to me pretty early on that wasn't necessarily a just intra-workout strategy. There were a lot of things that you could potentially be doing or should be doing just in your daily nutrition that can help influence that. So maybe we jump in first with, is there like strategies around just the way you're kind of fueling your day-to-day nutrition with carbohydrates that are a little more conducive to what you're going to be able to do when you're out there training?
Yeah. And so what I think you're getting at there is talking about gut training, right? So, we talk about gut training, and of course, the primary fuel source that we're going for during exercise is carbohydrate, even in the ultra space. So it's really kind of figuring out how we can get our gut, which, what does that even mean? I mean, we're mostly referring to the stomach and intestines when we say that, right? The GI tract is, of course, involves many more organs, but that's what we're really talking about. And it's how can we get the gut to tolerate more volume, more fluid, and absorb more carbohydrate without the GI distress that so many people, unfortunately, experience in the endurance space. And so, what's interesting about gut training is, people always think about, as you're kind of alluding to, it's like, yes, of course, the before, the during, that's really important about kind of practicing all of that. But people kind of forget that what you eat day to day also influences your ability to digest and absorb carbohydrate without as many issues. And of course, as many things are, like, we need more research in this space, right? But, we do know that a higher carbohydrate diet can influence kind of the activity of the transporters and how many transporters we have in the intestine, and thus kind of allow for a greater absorption and oxidation of carbohydrate during exercise as well. So if we think about, okay, well, day to day, and I guess how I like to think about this just more holistically. So, we're talking mostly about carbohydrate today, but of course we can't just think about one nutrient. We are interested in all the nutrients as athletes. So if we think about kind of building a really solid foundation with our daily diet, and then a really solid sports nutrition plan kind of goes on top of that, right? So you can't really have one without the other. You can't have, like, even if you have your daily eating like really dialed and then your sports nutrition is just a complete mess and you're winging it, whatever, like, that's not great. But then you can have your sports nutrition totally dialed, but then if you're not eating enough day to day, then that's not going to be great either. So I always like to really remind people to think of both of these things together, and they're just building off of one another. And so when it comes to kind of the daily intake of carbohydrate, we know that carbohydrates are so important as a fuel source during exercise, especially during longer duration activity, and especially during higher intensity activity, right? And, we also have to remind ourselves that carbohydrates are so important for so many other aspects of health. So it's a primary energy source for the brain. It helps protect your muscle, or preserve your muscle mass and protect your bones. It can help in some cases with iron absorption, with heart health, with gut health. I mean, there's so many things that carbohydrates are so important for aside from exercise. So again, I know sometimes athletes can be really like, have the single focus on performance. But again, I like to remind people like to think about things a little more holistically. But when it comes to, okay, well, what are the guidelines for research-based guidelines for carbohydrate intake? We're typically looking at that range of 5 to 12 grams of kilogram per kilogram of body weight per day. So that's often where endurance athletes are falling, somewhere between that. And we can kind of break it down by thinking about, okay, well, yes, we're making these little like day-to-day shifts. Like one of the things you talked about, on your own podcast, but you talked about on my show too, is kind of how you change up your own carbohydrate intake from one day to the next, from one training phase to another training phase. And so we do want to think about those things, both like day to day, like how are we shifting things around, but then also zooming out a little bit and thinking, oh, well, what's the volume like this week? What are things doing? So, if you're at a really low volume, maybe it's like less than an hour a day on average of easy effort, maybe like even 3 to 4 grams per kilogram is enough for you. But then kind of as you progress, whether it's in duration of easy efforts or intensity of slightly shorter efforts, that's kind of where we gradually build in this kind of framework of that 5 to 12. So, maybe like more of a moderate volume intensity of say like 1 to 2 hours per day of easy effort, or a shorter kind of intense, maybe that's more in that 5 to 7 grams per kilogram. And again, we kind of step up with that 10 to 12 gram per kilogram being carbohydrate loading or very, very high volume or intensity. So we think about that. And then the other thing I like to tell people too is like guidelines, they're there for a reason. They're based in research. They're quoted heavily all over the place. They're not rules though, right? They're guidelines. So sometimes people get really freaked out because they calculate these numbers and they sound insanely high from what they're used to doing. And so even though I'm still advising that people work up to this level, like, again, these are goals, these are targets, and we can play around with stuff. And I know you're like the king of playing around and experimenting and all that. So, you do want to kind of think about what makes sense for me, what feels good to me, what types of carbohydrates I'm having. Again, this is something we talked about, like, fiber, like higher fiber carbohydrates, which have so much more volume in your stomach versus kind of lower fiber, simpler, easier to digest carbohydrates. So there's a lot of places we can go with this, but that's the general way I'm talking about it with people.
Yeah, that was perfect. I was going to follow up with a question with the recommendations, because that's always an interesting one to me, because that number does sort of get thrown around. I don't know if it's intentionally casually, but it can be easy to be interpreted that way if you're kind of skimming things or not diving deep into what a conversation or something is referring to. And the way I always try to explain it is like, if we look at that range, because that's a pretty big range, 5 to 12 grams. And I think like, well, if we took someone like Connor Mance and look at his like typical workload and skewed him down to that 5 gram per kilogram, that is going to likely make up a minority macronutrient for him on a big training day. So you sort of have the situation where it's context specific with the individual's lifestyle, but it's also context specific within what they're doing inside their lifestyle. Because like all of us, Connor Mance also has an off-season rest days and things like that. So then there maybe is some opportunity for him to still be in the higher carb category at 5 grams per day, but probably not on his 20-mile long run with 12 miles of goal marathon pace in it or whatever he happens to be doing.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. I have no idea what Connor Mance does for his diet, so I can't comment on that. But yeah, I mean, what I always, on a, like the big takeaway and like on the most basic level, I just am always trying to tell people with carbs and just generally with what they're eating, we have to match like how you're feeling yourself to the work you're doing, right? So again, like the basic thing is as you step up how much volume and or intensity you're doing, the more carbohydrates you need, the more total energy intake you need. Protein needs are going up, fat needs, like everything's kind of scaling up, but like we do really focus on carbohydrate because that is such a big fuel source for people. So that's kind of that takeaway that I'm having people, keep with them at least on a basic level.
Mm-hmm. When you're working with athletes and you kind of do an assessment of what they've been doing and you determine, okay, this person is low on their carbohydrates in terms of what we'd like them to be for what their goals are, is that something where you're going to gradually work that up over time? Or is it something where you can start kind of being a little more aggressive with increasing their carbohydrate intake quite quickly and notice some of the performance advantages?
I'm always very gradual with anything I do. So in the daily diet, first of all, I'd much rather someone be adherent and be able to sustain a change that we make than, kind of try something and set themselves up to like not be able to do it. So typically, like I work with a lot of recreational, like very competitive, but recreational endurance athletes and other types of athletes. Everyone's very busy, and they might be dealing with other issues too. So maybe they're already dealing with GI issues, which, let's not load like a ton more carbohydrates on someone's gut or any other change. So yeah, I'm typically having them make small gradual changes and noticing those shifts and seeing how they're feeling. With carbohydrate, we also want to increase our fluid intake. So if you were to, and especially if you're also increasing fiber, we want to do that slowly. We want to add more fluid to that. The last thing we want is for you to be like bloated and constipated and just not feeling well, as that can happen if you increase carbs too fast, increase fiber too fast. I've had people, just come to me after having increased protein really quickly because of all the protein craziness going on right now. And they're like, oh, I suddenly need so much protein. And they're like suffering all these GI issues. And they come to me and we're like working it out. So yeah, I always advise make some kind of small shifts and maybe you're making a bunch of small shifts throughout the day. So it's not like all we're doing is adding, okay, just add one more piece of toast or add a glass of juice here or there. It's like, hey, yeah, maybe you're adding one piece of toast here and you're adding another fruit there and you're adding one more spoon of rice there. You're kind of just gradually shifting things and increasing your fluid intake. And then again, if we are shifting carbohydrate, again, in the daily diet, so we're not talking about intra-workout yet, we are paying attention to fiber, right? So because as I said, we don't yes, we want you to get enough fiber. Typically we're aiming for 30 to 40 grams per day. But if you are only consuming like 15 or 20 grams right now, you don't want to suddenly double that. Like, again, we want to be slow with that. And there's the other concern of you might be filling up really quickly and we have to maybe rely a little bit more on these easier to digest, kind of simpler carbohydrate sources to make sure you're getting enough in. So we're constantly kind of balancing all these different things, also things like food preferences and whatever else, other goals you're working on. So there are a lot of things when I'm working one-to-one with someone, like we are taking lots of different things into account. And then when it comes to intra-workout stuff, similarly, like if we're taking the before, like I always like to say, okay, well, with anything we're doing, whether it's daily diet or intra-workout, we always want to assess, what is your baseline? What are you currently doing now? How's it feeling? How's it going? And we go from there. So if someone is coming to me and they're not eating anything before working out, I'm not going to be like, great, yeah, let's go straight to doing like 1 gram per kilogram of carbohydrate. Like, no, like maybe, especially if they're a little scared or they've had GI issues or something, like maybe we're starting with, they're having a little sports drink, they're having a bite of a banana, they're having a graham cracker. Like, we might start really small, but we're trying to be consistent and gradually increasing, but like the consistency piece is important, but seeing what can you tolerate and keep trying and practicing, and getting some fluids in. Maybe we're starting with a sport product, maybe we're starting with a very simple carbohydrate. And then similarly, if our goal is, let's get you to 60 grams per hour, or whatever the goal might be, and you're at 30, I'm not going to bring you to 60. I'm going to say, hey, let's aim for 40, maybe 45. Let's take that for a little bit of time, see how that feels. And then, of course, we're thinking about where it's coming from, what types of products. We're looking at hydration strategies, because hydration can play into GI issues. And so that it's, with all this stuff, that's what's always tricky, is like, we're dealing with so many layers of things going on. So it can get a little bit complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. There is probably just a little bit of individual trial and error. That's part of the game. But I think if you look at it that way, you can not freak out when something happens and make an adjustment. I know with my experience, I was probably overly aggressive based on like your description with respect to the shifting of the daily nutrition stuff. I mean, I went pretty 180 very quickly with that. And I did notice early on the fiber side of things was like, yeah, with this volume of food I'm taking in, I probably need to be mindful of what carbohydrate sources I'm gravitating towards, and saving some of the more fiber rich ones maybe for the end of the day after my workouts were done and I had more space between then and the next training session. The one that I was a lot more gradual though with the introduction of intra-workout stuff, where I did kind of layer that up a little more gradually over time. I don't know what would happen if I would have gotten more aggressive. Maybe that would have been fine, but I did it the way you described, I guess. So I'm not going to look back and change it now.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, again, like with all this stuff, I mean, everyone is so different. Every time I say, oh, be careful of fiber before a workout, I'll get like a client that eats black beans and is fine, or whatever. It's like,
right.
There will always be people who are outliers or who have iron stomachs, and there will be people on the other extreme, right? So anytime we're kind of listing general recommendations or all these things, it's because, generally speaking, a large number of people, this would be helpful. But there were, again, this is why it's so important to try all the stuff yourself, to know your body, to know what you tolerate and don't tolerate, and also to not, like, especially with gut stuff, like, to know it's not set in stone. Like, we can train the gut. It's as we train our muscles when we're training, just training for a race or whatever, things can change. And I say this from personal experience. When I started out distance running, my stomach was a mess, largely because I was underfueling at the time unintentionally. But I mean, I had, like, my first marathon was a GI disaster. And for years I was so scared and scarred from that trauma of like having to basically poop between 2 cars in Paris. And, it was just like, never again, but then I realized, I'm like, I'm fine. I just needed to train my stomach. I needed to start eating enough. I don't have issues like that anymore. So it's, yeah. So just not thinking like, oh, this is just how it is. One thing, many dietitians often say is like, just because something is common, it doesn't mean it's normal. And you also don't have to just accept that as your reality. Right. So, don't be afraid to kind of keep playing around, and also don't like feel like despair, like, oh, all hope is lost. I'll be like this forever,
Hey runners, once upon a time, I decided to run 100 miles straight on a treadmill. You may remember the live stream where Bert Kreischer joined for an hour near the end. One of the most difficult aspects of that effort was the whole time it felt like the treadmill was telling me what to do versus the control you feel when running outside. That became a big mental hurdle as the miles piled up. If you are in the market for a new treadmill, I'd encourage you to consider the new Wahoo KICKR Run. It has a feature called dynamic pacing, where the treadmill matches your pace automatically, putting the control back into your hands. In my opinion, this is one of the most coolest innovations in treadmill technology right now. Head over to wahoofitness.com for more details, and if it's a good match for you, get a free heart rate monitor with purchase using promo code OUTLIER. Links and details can be found in the show notes.
Yeah, it's kind of the same way with coaching too, where there are great starting points and kind of recommendations and like proper order of operations and things like that. But then at the end of the day, once you start applying those, the communication piece is huge in terms of finding where those individual variances are going to be. So I imagine for you, it's kind of the same way. You've got maybe a scaffolding of what you'd like to see, and you start putting that in place, and then you're like, okay, well, this needs to adjust for this person, or we need to spend a little more time here to get them to that spot versus what you'd maybe see on average.
Yeah. And then there's also the layer of them as human beings. Like, what are they actually willing and able to change?
Yeah.
So, I have people where, I genuinely believe that they should, for what they're doing right now in this season of life and the amount that they're willing to eat and all this, that they need to reduce the exercise, and they're not willing. It's like, well, okay, like there's only so much, there's a ceiling at a certain point sometimes with
Right.
the work I do with people, or they eat a certain way. And like, I was just having this discussion with a past client of mine that went for a run with this morning, who used to be a vegan, and now she's kind of brought some other foods in after having a baby because that's what felt good for her body. And we were discussing, a vegan diet for many people can work wonderfully that when it's really thoughtful and intentional. And then I encounter people where it's just not working for them, at least not with the combination of things going on in their life. So, I think it's just one of these things where we have these guidelines, we have all these things we know. I mean, our knowledge is always evolving, right? But what we know for now, and then we have like all the other layers of things, all the details of someone's life, what they're willing to be able to do, the mental piece of things, if someone has body stuff going on. I mean, there are lots of things involved when you're working with someone. And sometimes it truly is like, I think for you, I get the sense where, you kind of just like, let's try this out. And it's very like, not mechanical, but it's very, it's more scientific. It's like, oh, I'm boop, boop, boop. And we kind of change these things around. With some people, it's just so much. It's just, they can't just switch things around like that. It's like, it's not just like levers you push, does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And people get habits, I think, and there's some comfort there, right? There's predictability with a lot of that stuff. So yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I don't know what it was. I got really curious about some of that stuff at one point, and I think that just became my kind of my baseline or my interest point. So then like the switching things in and out was the excitement. Like even when I was low carbohydrate, I would always go through these phases where like after a training cycle and a race, I would look, okay, what were the food inputs that I had for that one that got me to the macronutrients I wanted? What can I shift out and shift in differently just to play around with something different? So I think there was like maybe just a little bit of an interest there in terms of curiosity, maybe, I don't know, or a lack of that habit grabbing type of behavior with respect to the food, at least.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, that's what I love about you. You're very curious, you're very flexible. And I think those are great qualities to have as a human being, but also as an athlete.
One thing I was going to ask you about when you were talking about kind of someone reintroducing gradually, do you see a lot with that? Because I think like if you have someone who's doing just very little to no fueling during their workouts and you bring in a little bit, I find that to be interesting because for one, they're probably going to notice a decent difference just with even like suboptimal, but greater than they had before fueling inputs.
Yeah.
And then at a fairly low risk, because like if someone's going from no fueling to like 10, 15 grams of carbohydrate per hour, they're likely not getting a digestive issue from that. If they are, they may have some other issues that you'd probably be able to speak more to than I would. But then they kind of get that win of like, oh, that felt a little better. And then maybe it kind of like helps you with the adherence side of things, because now you can say, well, what if I told you it could be a little better yet? And then now they've already got that baseline, that new baseline at slightly higher, and you can kind of start micro stressing it up.
Yeah. You know what's more common than that? I'd say most people who come to me, not all, but a lot of people come to me, they may not be consuming enough during, but most people are consuming something. It may be one gel in 2 hours, which is way below what I would want them to do, but they're consuming something, right? But I'd say more often people are not eating before, or eating enough before a run, like a shorter run or a long run or a workout or something like that. It's often like the before and the after that we're working on. And especially when someone is doing like an earlier morning session, right? And so often what I'm encouraging them to do is like, yeah, listen to your body, see how it feels. Do you notice a difference? And people don't always notice a difference. Like I tell them like, tell me, is it like positive, neutral, negative, you know? And a lot of times people are saying neutral in the moment, like they don't necessarily feel the difference in the workout itself. It's much later in the day that they're noticing, oh, wow, I'm not like reaching for sweets at night, or I'm not like ravenous at this point or whatever. So but yeah, absolutely. It's looking for kind of that positive feedback in your body in whatever way, shape, or form it's coming, and whether it's the performance itself in that session, whether it's the recovery. When I get people in a long run to actually fuel and hydrate appropriately, and then they come back and they're not like, they don't have a headache and they're not like crashing on the couch afterwards, and they're able to actually like be a human and live their life and deal with their other responsibilities, not like just feel dead. That's huge. That's really huge. And then we also, some of the work we do is a little bit more subtle. And because, when especially when I have people who are a little bit resistant to fueling, and it might be fear of weight gain or whatever it might be, I've had people who were like, oh, wow, I was able to have dinner with my friends and not be like staring at my plate and be like stressed out and anxious. I could actually talk with someone and just enjoy my meal and stop when I'm full. And, so there are all kinds of different things we measure in terms of quote unquote progress or success, or however you want to call it. But yes, we definitely look for those things. And then sometimes we get negative things like, oh, well, okay, that didn't work, or we need to slow down, or this was not the right product. And all information is great information, and we use that, and then we kind of adapt and figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing you mentioned that I find really interesting, and this is something I had to work on, because like intuitively and preferentially, I just would rather eat a ton at the end of the day and catch up. And I don't know what that is. Maybe it's just like the busyness of the day, and probably some degree
Sure.
it's not as comfortable to have like food in your stomach when you're like trying to be productive. Whereas at the end of the day, I think you kind of like turn down and you get that like sort of like, okay, now I'm done. And then it's just like, okay, I'm going to feast. And that proved to be so unsuccessful with respect to like sleeping well and just feeling good in general, that I kind of learned the hard way, I guess, that, all right, I need to be mindful of making sure I'm getting enough in during that bulk of the day, so that at the end of the day, I'm not trying to catch up by nearly as much. And I'd be curious if that is a common experience that you see people coming to you with, or is that something that's pretty unique?
Well, my first question when you said that, you said you don't feel as comfortable being full, like, or eating when you're being productive. Like that, like, what do you mean by that? Like just feeling full, or feel like, what do you mean
So
exactly?
like if you kind of know if you have like a larger meal and then you feel just like a little bit tired afterwards.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, got
So
it. Yeah, that kind of slump in the afternoon is what you're
mhm,
talking about. But
yeah,
you don't feel an energy slump if you didn't eat? Like you're not feeling kind of a little bit of a dip or a crash or anything like that?
nothing extremely, it's not like and I guess when I say like backloading, I'm not talking like 2/3 of my energy or anything like that. But like
Mm,
the way I like to think of it is, if I'm finding myself in a situation where I'm getting anywhere near half of my calorie needs in the like around dinner time, that's too extreme, lopsided. But
yeah.
for me, like even in that context, I'm still getting in like a couple thousand calories during like kind of like the morning to early afternoon time frame.
Okay.
So there's
Yeah.
still like energy coming in, but probably just not
Yeah.
enough to keep up with the workload I'm doing if I were to just have a normal dinner after that.
Yeah. So I definitely see this is a very common pattern, but to me, what you're describing sounded more intentional in a way because you preferred to eat that way. And usually, people coming to me, it's more unintentional. So people almost always are like, there sometimes people are kind of nailing the breakfast, and there's like a huge nutrition gap during the day at some point, whether it's like between lunch and dinner, or maybe it's between breakfast and lunch, or wherever it is, or both. um, and and then yeah, sometimes people like have all the best intentions, but they're not planning or preparing, or they got stuck in a meeting, or they're taking care of their kids, or whatever the case may be. So often what I see is people are often like, they're making sure their training's happening, like, because that just always happens, and then they're just not giving that same attention to their fueling. And so my role is always to come in and be like, those two go hand in hand. They are just as important. You cannot do one without the other. And if you cannot prioritize fueling, you cannot prioritize training at that same level. We have to bring it all down. So that's kind of my like non-negotiable with people. And so this is where we're just like, identify the obstacles. Like, what is it that's getting in the way of you fueling consistently and adequately? Because I am usually trying to get people to have 3 consistent meals and a handful of snacks kind of throughout the day, so they're not going more than 2 to 4 hours without eating, right? And at all of those meals and snacks, we have carbohydrate to meet your carbohydrate needs because they are high. And depending on a meal, you know, it's be a balanced meal, and then a snack may or may not have like protein, fat, fiber, all that stuff, depending on timing and if you're about to work out and all the other things. So so we kind of are identifying like, what are the obstacles and how do we overcome them? If they're purely logistical, like, oh, I just didn't have anything available, or you know, something like that, then it's like, okay, cool, well, let's throw some snacks in your car, you know, keep them in your glove compartment, a little console in between, throw some in your bag. Like, you know, is there anything you can prep? Like, what kind of convenience items are, whether it's perishable or non-perishable, can you keep around? What can you carry to the office? Like, we kind of just talk through how can we remove that barrier and make sure this happens for you. And it doesn't mean you have to spend hours meal prepping. So we are trying to be very practical and realistic when it comes to this stuff. And then if it's not just logistical, but more of a belief system, and this is where, again, food can be really tricky and complicated for people, and maybe they just don't think they need to eat that much, or whatever the case may be. A lot of caretakers, if I'm working with a parent or something like that, maybe they're just really prioritizing caring for others and not for themselves, and they can't seem to make the time for themselves to fuel, but they make the time for training, you know, again, This is the pattern. And then again, we have to go through like, okay, well, this is a little bit getting more into the mental side. Obviously, I'm not a therapist. So like, when this needs to be deferred to a therapist, we do that. But then it's really making sure, like, how can we make sure you are, you know, prioritizing yourself and fueling yourself and make sure it's important. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but for sure, I see the pattern of people trying to play catch up at night. And sometimes they just simply can't play catch up. If their needs are so high, they're training for an ultra or an Ironman or whatever the case may be, or they just fueled so little at such low amounts during the day, it can interrupt sleep. We then get into the whole issue of low energy availability, which has so many different performance and health impacts, negative impacts, and just all kinds of things kind of pop up from there. So yeah, I'd say that's one of the first things I do with people when I'm doing like a full assessment. It's looking for those nutrition gaps and figuring out how to correct those. And that kind of opens up the discussion, because very quickly I can see, like, is this just a simple like logistical situation that we can solve with some planning and preparation and all of that? Or is this a little bit more complicated and we have to have some, you know, many different discussions about why these gaps are there?
Yeah, I mean, those are all some really interesting things too. I wonder too, with like the relative energy deficiency syndrome stuff too, when you get those cases where the person it's not like they're eating a tremendous amount underneath what they need, but they're maybe just not fueling at the time their body's really asking for it. And we do have these, like, especially if you're a morning training person, you kind of have this window of time where your energy output is just massive relative to the total. And then it's like, if I always wonder about like some of the, like, how the body's actually perceiving that. Is it like, are you putting yourself in a position where like you're metabolically creating problems because you're like scarce in the times your body's asking for the most, and then you're abundant in the times your body's maybe a little more relaxed and less screaming for fuel, so to speak?
Yeah, and there's research that's looking at both kind of within day energy deficits and then kind of slightly more short-term, acute, and then chronic low energy availability. And the thing to think about, so like, not eating enough is a form of stress on the body, and that has impacts on all kinds of different things, on blood sugar, on all kinds of stuff. And you know, stress is one of those things where it can just like inflammation. Like, it's not like all stress is bad, all inflammation is bad, but like too much of it, chronic, like that's when it can be bad and harmful. So when we think about like what it's doing and how we can best kind of care for ourselves, you know, the other thing I'd mention is recovery, right? So recovery, often people are like pushing, oh, you have to do it within 30 to 60 minutes. Then other people are like, oh, no, you don't, you know, this whole thing. And like, I like to think about it as like there are two windows of recovery. And especially if you're doing a long and or hard session, like your body, as you're kind of pointing to, like your body's just so receptive to getting that nutrition. And more importantly, it's an eating opportunity in your day. And you have to like take advantage of that, especially if you're a busy person, you have a lot going on. And especially if you've just been out like exercising for hours on end, right? So you already may have, if you're an ultra runner, you did a really long run, you may have already missed a meal. Or, you know, if you're really prioritizing carbohydrate as that first meal, maybe you didn't have that much protein in there. And depending on what you took during, like you're still in a deficit, you need to make up for it. So your body is just really primed and ready to go to be rehydrated and, you know, get that protein and carbs and all the things in. And then also recovery is ongoing. So recovery is this, it's not like the door slams shut, but we have that kind of period there. And then the rest of the day. So also remembering to kind of like continue to kind of eat throughout the day is really important there. But yes, so we do, you know, when it comes to kind of low energy availability and all that stuff, like we just have to remember that our body is, it's very demanding with this energy, and us just sitting around doing absolutely nothing, not even digesting food, requires a ton of energy. People forget that. You know, people are like, oh, it's a rest day, or I didn't do anything today and I don't need to eat all those carbs because I'm just sitting here. And it's like, well, you just sitting there, first of all, are you really just sitting there, or are you like cleaning the house and running up and down the stairs and walking your dog and blah blah blah? But also like you still have huge energy demands, and people kind of forget that. So, you know, when we talk about energy availability, what that's talking about is having enough energy for all of the normal functions of your body, of just keeping itself alive after the cost of exercise, because we don't get to choose if we're putting energy towards exercise. We just do because we have to, you know? And so we want to have extra money. If you can even think about like in terms of a budget, we want to have enough of a budget left over for all of the essential things going on in our system to keep us healthy and functioning well. So yeah, that does mean that we want to be eating consistently and adequately. And again, in line with the amount of activity that we do, and not just our intentional exercise, but all forms of movement. You know, like I just had a client come in who she's training for a Boston Marathon, and she's like, oh yes, and I play like what I call old lady tennis like 4 times a week. And I thought that didn't count, but then my coach was like, it definitely counts. And it's like, yes, that does count.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like really just the whole picture of how active you are. It's important to think about that with fueling.
It is no secret, if you listen to this podcast, that I am a big fan of perceived effort when it comes to guiding your training efforts. This can be a learning process though, and can be supported with lots of post-workout tools. Training Peaks is one of the best tools for monitoring your training progress, and my go-to tool when coaching individuals and with my own training assessments. At Training Peaks, you can get deep into the data, assess training load, recovery, and easily monitor progress across all training intensities. It is the perfect example of a program that takes much of the guesswork out of your training and coaching experience by making sure you have multiple data points pointing in the right direction to inform your training inputs. You can get 20% off a premium subscription with promo code HPOPOD by heading to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. Details and links can be found in the show notes.
Yeah, I want to kind of move into like intra-workout or intra-race fueling and kind of get a grip on that, because I think it's interesting to me because we sort of had like this wave of low carbohydrate nutrition that sort of got surpassed by this new wave of high carbohydrate, in some cases extremely high carbohydrate nutrition. And when I first saw the super high come in, you start seeing some of these numbers reported of like 150 grams per hour and things like that. I was like, I wonder like how many people are going to jump on that a little too quickly, have massive digestive issues, and then we see another wave of low carbohydrate come as a result. And it's like, is this going to be a pendulum thing? This is going to go back and forth as people kind of get kind of too quickly or too quick, and also just misapplying what they see versus what they actually need. Because I think like the general message of getting in more carbohydrates during your training session to improve performance is going to be a meaningful one for a lot of people, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone needs to go up to 150 grams per hour.
No.
So
definitely not.
I would love to hear like when you're working with someone, like how you're sort of formulating like some targets with that, if you're looking at just like workload oxidation rates and their body weight and things like that, or if there's more to it than just the kind of the math side of things.
Yeah. So first I'll start out by saying very few people I personally work with are going above 90 grams an hour, or need it. Like, so, I mean, I'm all for carbs. I love it. I love that people, a lot of, elite professional athletes out there are, you know, really pushing the limits on carb intake. And it's for many, for many people, it's going great. And we see in the cycling world, they've been doing that forever. And people are just putting down crazy numbers of carbs per hour. And that's awesome. That said, for the kind of average recreational athlete, that's not necessarily what someone needs to be doing. And again, maybe it is in your case and you can tolerate it and you're doing great on it. Awesome, great. Just from my experience and the type of clients I tend to get, for the most part, like a lot of my people aren't even consuming 60 grams an hour. So it's the opposite problem. Like, hey, can we just get you to take in the bare minimum? So, I mean, we can revisit that in a second, but I will just say, like, I love the high carb stuff, but I agree some people are going to kind of swing to that pendulum a little too quickly and be like, oh no, that didn't work for me. And it's like, hey, can we just like maybe start somewhere in the middle and like chill there for a bit and see how that goes for you, and then gradually work up. And then maybe once you get to 90, if you feel like, I know you do, or like you do 90 to 100 grams or so, I don't know if that's changed since we last chatted, but like cool, like if that works for you and you want to push a little bit more, great. But like you also have to keep in mind, like, what are you doing? Are you like, well, number one, are you running or not running? So obviously jostling the stomach around can increase GI distress. Are you doing an ultra versus a marathon? Like what's your intensity level? I mean, there's so many things we want to think about when it comes to how much you're taking in. But just to kind of go back for a second. So I always like to start with kind of the guidelines. Again, they're not rules, but they're guidelines, and they're a good way to kind of direct you when you're not really sure where to start. And so for the during piece, we can also talk about before and after and guidelines there if you want, but just to start with during, we're looking at typically anywhere between 30 and 90 now plus grams per hour. We've recently been adding that plus, but typically, yeah, 30 to 90 grams or more. And that's going to depend on several things, including intensity, of course, tolerance, but most importantly, duration. So usually we're doing that 30 to 60 gram per hour mark if you're anywhere below 2.5 hours. And then above 2.5 or 3 hours is where we go into that 60 to 90 grams or higher range. So that, again, that's kind of what the research says. Those are the guidelines that are quoted literally everywhere you turn, And then if you're doing like a very high intensity, shorter session between 45 minutes and 75 minutes, that's where that kind of like small amounts of carbohydrate, mouth rinse, all that, that's where that lands. And then anything kind of below 45 minutes, we're usually saying don't really need carbohydrate unless maybe you didn't feel well beforehand, or you just want it, or you're practicing or whatever. So again, there's always flexibility with all this stuff. So like I tell people, let's say I get an ultra runner who's really working on gut training. They have a 2-hour session, so a short, long run, and they're really working on increasing above 60 grams, or maybe they're practicing 80 grams or 70 grams, or whatever the case may be. Maybe they're working on real food strategies, etc. I'm going to have them fuel that 2-hour run. I'm not going to have them be in the 30 to 60 gram range. If they're already feeling good in that 60 to 90 gram range, cool, let's practice that. Let's take advantage of that time and then, kind of try out some strategies. So again, all this, we have to be flexible with what we're doing there, but that's what the guidelines say. In terms of body weight, so these guidelines historically have been independent of body weight, and were more about what can we absorb. So that 60 gram amount was historically connected to what we can absorb in the intestine of glucose, right? And it kind of, the science was kind of showing that, okay, 60 gram is kind of that limiter, that we are limited by how much we can transport, through the intestines into the bloodstream. But then we started, creating products with multiple sugar sources, right? So then we have that kind of glucose, fructose, or maltodextrin, fructose mixtures. And then we don't have just one bridge to cross, we have multiple bridges. And so that kind of opened up that 60 to 90 gram range. And now, of course, we're going higher. So where we kind of, so the body weight piece of things, there was a study, I forgot, it wasn't that long ago, a smaller study, but it was kind of hinting at maybe body weight does actually play a part in it. Maybe people in larger bodies, as well as kind of thinking about kind of intensity and all that stuff, maybe we do need more carbohydrate. So I actually did an episode of my own podcast and a dietitian on that topic. But yes, but historically these numbers are more independent of sex and body weight. They're just kind of, this is what we can do. It would, in my mind, make sense though that body weight would play a part. But so that, again, that's something that individually you have to just kind of test and play around with and see what makes sense for you depending on what you're doing. So if you're the type of athlete that maybe sometimes you're doing short, fast stuff, and maybe sometimes you're doing longer, slower stuff, or maybe you're a multi-sport athlete, like you might have different targets in different situations, maybe in different temperatures, because we know heat also can make things harder on gut absorption and GI, can cause some GI distress and such. So yeah, that's kind of the guidelines. That's for the during, and that's usually how I'm approaching it. And really, like when it comes down to, okay, like we're setting, if I'm kind of trying to create goals with people, the starting point is, okay, what are your goals for carbs per hour, grams per hour? So we set a goal for that, depending on where they're at, what we're doing. We're trying to determine, okay, fluid goals, what are your ounces per hour or liters per hour, whatever you're doing there. If we can do a sweat test to really get some solid individual feedback on that, great, because we know that both, well, sodium and fluid are very, very, very individual in terms of losses. So we kind of set a goal there, and then we can then think about sodium. Sodium should always be tied to fluid. So I'm usually thinking about sodium more in milligrams per liter, not in milligrams per hour. But if you have like a fluid goal, and you can kind of work that all out. But we set these kind of 3 things we're thinking about. If you're an ultra runner and we're thinking about protein and or fat, real foods, like that's a whole separate thing, but we kind of work that in. But we have that. And then from there, we figure, okay, cool, how are we going to get there? And there's no one right way. There are a million products on the market now, something for everyone really. And it just becomes this like giant puzzle that you're trying to kind of piece together. And what is the simplest plan that we can formulate with some flexibility? And again, are you running a marathon where maybe you are just doing the same product over and over again? Are you doing, a 12-hour race like you? Maybe we're mixing things in. Are you doing a 24-hour race? So this is where what you're doing really kind of becomes important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Along those lines too, I remember one thing that was interesting to me while I was kind of going through the process was I had Jeff Magavero on the podcast, and we were looking kind of at our fueling strategies, and we had pretty similar averages. I think he might've been a little bit higher, like maybe 10 grams per hour higher than I was. But one thing we noticed, and this kind of looked pretty similar to what I saw with a lot of other guys that were reporting their data at like the 100-mile distance, was that a lot of these guys kind of start out quite a bit higher, and then they kind of ease down as the race goes on to where the end, they might have like some extremes where it's like, oh, they had 150 grams that hour, but then they might have an hour where it's like 65 grams, and all sort of works itself out to be their average of right around 100 grams per hour. Whereas for me, I was just like, I didn't touch anything that high, like 150 grams, but I was basically rock solid within 5-10 grams per hour between 90 to 100. Yeah. And I was just like, we were kind of just hypothesizing about that. It's like, I wonder if there is something with that where like getting a little too aggressive with it, you're going to end up at this number. So at that point, do you just hedge? I hesitate to say hedge low, because 100 grams isn't all that low, but like,
no, it's not.
Instead of going 130 to 150 grams in early stages, when you're maybe a little more receptive to it, stay at 100, and staying at 100 allows you to remain at 100 versus having that fall off. And I guess whether that's important or not, assuming there's no digestive issues, maybe it's not, maybe it's a preference thing. But my intuition is that I would rather have a very consistent, steady stream of that coming in, especially if my workload is staying relatively consistent throughout, versus having these big boluses and then underscoring opportunity or points during the race.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would think that kind of keeping things a little bit more even keel is better than having those like bare loads and lower. I mean, if someone's having 150 and then 65 another, I mean, there's got to be something going on there. Like that has to be a sign of like maybe GI stuff or something was happening where they couldn't get it in. I would imagine. I would find it hard to believe that would be part of someone's plan. But yeah, I think I agree that, and this is where you just kind of have to play around. And then especially if it's a race where it's really hot, just like you have to, depending on race conditions, you have to pull back on, change up your pacing strategy depending on the environment or what else is going on. Like similarly, you might have to adjust your, you have to adjust your fluid plan, obviously, when it's hot. We know we sweat more, but you might have to kind of pull back a little bit, whether it's on intensity or your pacing, whether it's kind of how maybe you're doing smaller amounts more frequently. There are lots of different strategies and things we can do to kind of improve tolerance, or maybe we're just kind of pulling back a little bit on how much. And that's something you have to kind of play around with. And I'd say yeah, when you're kind of an elite level athlete and 100, like doing, quote, quote, just 100 grams versus trying to get up there to that 130, 140, 150, thinking it's potentially going to give you that performance edge. Yeah, I mean, that's tricky because, maybe you are willing to kind of place that bet because maybe that's the thing that's going to get you on the podium or not. And you just have to kind of play around with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's actually a good point too, because heat is like a lot of those like reportings have come out of Western states, which is a lot warmer of a race than I would be comparing mine to. So it's possible also that, and this is a topic we can get into as well, is like, they're just carrying a little more relative dehydration than I was, and therefore their ability to tolerate, say 60, 70 grams per hour at that point when they'd been out there for 13, coming on 14 hours was just going to be different than myself running in. I think it was like in maybe the low 60s or something like that all day long. So,
and altitude. So,
yeah.
We're talking about like, if we're looking at like Hard Rock or any of these kinds of races where you're getting crazy up there, that obviously has an impact on what you can tolerate as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I did want to kind of jump into the hydration stuff, especially since you were talking about it with respect to the carbohydrate side of things. Is one thing that I started thinking about more with that was there was a study that was, or I don't know if it was a study, but they were looking at this at Western states years ago. And basically the kind of the end product was there's really no way you're crossing the finish line hydrated. You're going to have some level of dehydration and there's no way you're going to do that. So don't try to fight a battle that's not winnable. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, obviously you don't want to neglect it. And in fact, when I read that, I was like, this is like almost a zero mistake situation, because if you're already in best case scenario finishing dehydrated, that just means you can't be making mistakes with that, because if you're underdoing hydration along the way in an effort where even if you're doing it right, you weren't going to get to what would be ideal, then that's got to be kind of something you really try to nail. And then the more I thought about like, yeah, I wonder how many of these digestive issues are based on that then too, where people are just off on their hydration. And then therefore what was working in the first half of the race is no longer working. And they're attributing that more so to, I just can't tolerate carbohydrates during race days. Like, well, maybe you could if you were getting more detailed with your hydration. So our hydration strategies and our cooling strategies have also been proven quite quickly in the ultra running world, along with the high carb. So I always wonder some of that too is like, maybe we're seeing some of these higher numbers because people are getting better at that as well.
Sweat loss rates and electrolytes can be challenging, especially when the miles pile up and the temps climb. To help solve this problem, I got a sweat test done that suggested that I lose approximately 614 milligrams per liter of sweat when I'm out there working out. Keep up with this, I turned to Element Electrolytes, convenient single-serve packs, and Element Sparkle, which is their latest offering that combines carbonated water and their top-notch electrolyte flavors. Check out their variety of flavors at drinklmnt.com/HPO. If you use that URL, you can get a free sample pack with your first purchase. If it turns out they don't meet your needs, rest assured they have a 30-day money-back risk-free guarantee. Details and link can be found in the show notes.
Yeah, and hydration is one of these things where it's like, when we're thinking about the hierarchy of like what's the most important thing you can do fueling wise, like carbs and fluids are kind of the top things. And then as you get longer, sodium is also, I mean, sodium's always important, but the longer duration stuff, sodium becomes even more important. But yeah, hydration's so important because it does help with kind of reducing perceived effort and cognitive function. I mean, there's so many things that happen, like even mild dehydration. So we always point to that greater than 2%, right? That's of body loss through sweat. Like that's often what is quoted a lot of the times. Even mild dehydration can lead to kind of some of these impairments. And in terms of the GI piece, so already when you're exercising, we have that blood flow being shunted away from the gut to the working muscles, and heat and then also dehydration is worsening that situation. So if kind of more blood flow is, going away from the stomach, and it can delay gastric emptying, or stomach emptying, it can kind of lead to more of that sloshing, kind of bloating sensation that people get, maybe some more like upper GI issues there. So yeah, usually when someone's coming to me, if they're complaining of nausea and vomiting, the first thing we talk about is hydration versus kind of lower GI stuff that could be something different. But yeah, so as you're saying, like people might be complaining, oh, carbs, but it's like, is it carbs or is it the fluid, or is it the concentration of the carbohydrate that you're taking in? Like maybe it's just too concentrated, and that's leading to kind of some issues there. So we can play around with, what is the concentration of your sports drink? Are you taking in like a very thick gel? Because with gels, some you do need water, some you don't. So are you taking this thick gel, and you're also doing a high carb drink? Like what's going on there? This is where you do kind of have to be a little bit careful with which products you're combining, and also your fluid intake. This is where also doing a fluid loss test or a sweat test can be really important. And so as you're, pointing out there, yeah, the point is never to replace 100% of your losses. Like not only is that not possible for many people, it's also just not the goal. It's not practical. And then when we think about some of these races where logistically it's really not possible, you can't possibly carry that much water when you're in between aid stations for however many hours. So when we're thinking about like creating a fluid plan, number one, if we have sweat test results, which I always encourage people to do if they have, and have very simple instructions on my website, eatforendurance.com, if anyone wants them. But if you have a scale and you can do that simple fluid loss test at least once or twice in a training cycle, ideally in like slightly different conditions, that gives us some great information. And then we can think about, okay, how much do we need to replace? And typically we're trying to replace between 50 and 90% of losses. And again, kind of like with the carbs where everything kind of scales up the longer you go, or the higher intensity, it's like similarly with fluid, it's like, okay, if you are doing a shorter effort, then as long as you're not like an insanely high or heavy sweater, we can kind of be on that lower end of that range. So maybe more like 50 to 75% of losses, because the longer you go, think about it, the longer you go, your sweat losses are compounded. The more total sweat you lose, the easier it is to be losing that more than 2% of your body weight through sweat, right? So in order to reduce the amount of dehydration that's happening, because as you said, we're never going to be preventing dehydration, we have to be replacing a higher percentage of your losses. So once we get kind of over that 2 or 3 hour mark, then yeah, maybe we're going more for that 75 to 90% of losses, if it's possible. Because again, we have to think about tolerance. We have to think about what your sweat losses are. If someone's losing 2.5 liters an hour, like we're not going to be replacing 90% of that most likely. So it's also a question of, okay, how can we train your body to tolerate as much as possible if you are a heavy sweater? And then the duration will determine that too, because maybe you can tolerate taking 1.5 liters an hour or whatever the amount is, but for X number of hours, but at a certain point you can't. So it's very tricky. It's something we just have to keep playing around with. But yes, I very much recommend that people do a sweat test so we can kind of dial in the hydration plan a bit more, and then just being aware of how it's affected. So like if it is, if you are doing a higher intensity effort, if it is warmer out, if you're at altitude, like there are certain things that do influence kind of your sweat rate, and then we have to make adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's always interesting. I think like it's an actual thing people can do at home to gauge some of that stuff and at least get some ballpark figures put down to play around with, and then see how they feel in their workouts and then ultimately in races. The harder one is always sometimes figuring out what their electrolyte needs are, because that's such a wide range. And
yes,
I'd be curious if you've got an approach. I usually just suggest, if people are totally unaware, they haven't gone and got a test that kind of suggests where they're at, just start around where the averages are, like around like 800 to a gram of electrolytes per liter of fluid that they're taking in, which I like. I like that it's per liter, because then it's just like you can kind of just drink what you're supposed to drink based on the conditions and not have to worry about having like different amounts. It's kind of just like you tie that electrolyte to the fluid that you're taking in. And then if you drink more, then you have the right concentration. You drink less, you still have the right concentration. But inevitably, you're going to have people that are like way up on the other side of the bell curve on the far right, where they're like double that. And then there's going to be people who are just barely losing anything and could probably almost get away with no electrolyte intake, because any salty food they eat during the day is probably going to account for their loss rate.
Yeah.
So like once you kind of like play around with that middle, if it's still not working, are there signs that you look for that suggest like, hey, you might just be a heavy sweat or heavy electrolyte loss person, or a really low, and we should just course correct downward or upward based on what we're seeing?
Yeah. And just real fast first before I answer that, I take a similar approach where, if someone's coming to me, we're generally starting in that kind of average range. I might go down to like 600 to 900 milligrams a liter or something like that, but somewhere it's probably like 500 to 1,000, depending on also if someone thinks they're a saltier sweater. We kind of get a little bit more anecdotal kind of, reports from that person, and then we kind of pick some products there. But yeah, if we've kind of explored all of the options, we've done the sweat tests, we've dialed in the products, we think it's appropriate, we've gut trained, we've done all the things, and someone is like really consistently having issues, especially in longer duration and or like hot events or training sessions, that's where I'm like, maybe we want to get a little bit, some additional information, or maybe this person really is kind of either on the high end or on the low end. And so that's sometimes where I will have someone do a test. It's not like these tests, really are like 100% accurate. They're not, but it's just a little bit of information that can be helpful. And especially depending on which one you do, some of them are like fully not accurate, but maybe I'll have them get a test and we kind of look at that. But yeah, so the things I look for. So when someone is taking in too much salt, well, the funny thing is both ends of the spectrum, whether you're too little, too high, GI issues.
Yeah,
so I'm like, great, awesome. That's really helpful. But like usually, I mean, if someone's taking in too little, like you can normally tell from their fueling plan, unless again, they're just like they're taking a normal amount and they're such a salty sweater. But yeah, so we're looking for things like, is someone like really thirsty? Like they're drinking and they're just so thirsty. Sometimes we look at frequency of urination, which again can be potentially a sign of just fluid overload, generally speaking, like overhydrating, because we do get people overhydrating, or maybe like you're just trying to get rid of some of that salt. We can look at like fluid retention as well. Those are some of the things that I look for. And then yeah, GI distress being kind of the other one. It's really hard. I will say sodium is one of those things where like so many people get tripped up and can be super confusing. And even myself as a dietitian, sports dietitian for over 11 years, I'm like, had to take a step back and like, okay, like let me think about this for a minute. Cause like, it's not like something like, it's not like I look at this and I just automatically know this is exactly how much you need. It is something that I also have to figure out with somebody. And it can be really confusing sometimes. And the other thing too, like, you mentioned like, okay, you just mix your drink, you drink your thing, it's the same concentration. But where it gets really tricky is that maybe someone, like if someone's not taking, like, let's say someone's taking a gel that has 0 or low, very low sodium, great, easy peasy, like great. But if someone's taking products, food, whatever, where more sodium is coming in, or maybe they're switching up the drinks they're using, like it can get a little bit confusing. And like when you're tired, you don't want to be doing math in your head. And this is where it just gets hard to track. And like, oh, suddenly I'm actually, because sometimes some of my clients, we haven't talked about protein yet, but like sometimes my clients, maybe they're doing a recovery drink because they want to get liquid protein in, and that has lower sodium than like the typical drink, so it can get really tricky if you're not just doing the same thing hour after hour. And then often when we're, when we have someone doing 100 miles, not on the track or on like a flat course like you, but like a mountain race or something where it is, maybe they're not as fast as you. They're really, maybe it's like over 24 hours. Like they cannot do the same thing all the time. So this is where it can get really tricky. And so again, we do our best to simplify, but yeah, it can be hard.
And I think the other thing too is like what I'll tell coaching clients is like, we want to be like directionally in the right spot with that sort of thing. Cause it's not like, we're not so feeble that if you're, 500 milligrams of sodium off 1 hour, all of a sudden the wheels are coming off.
Totally. Yeah.
So thankfully absolutely. We're more resilient than that in most cases. So I think it's generally like a lot of times just like getting people to even think about it in the first place versus going out there with just the idea of I need a drink and I should take in some electrolytes occasionally or eat some salty foods occasionally. And that's maybe where people will have the biggest issues with that stuff is they're not thinking about it at all.
Yeah, not thinking about it all. Or they think that every single problem they have, they're like, oh, pop a salt pill. And it's like,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
you don't, that's not the answer to all life's problems. Okay. Like, I wish it were that simple, but yeah, I think paying attention to what you're craving, what tastes good. Are you craving plain water? Or do you just need kind of like a flavor change? And when we're talking about ultra endurance athletes specifically, like, it is really important to have different flavors and textures, whether it's like sweet, salty, more of a fresh tasting, like a fruit kind of thing, or crunchy, like having that variety, even if it's just a little bit. So even if it's not I mean, there are only so many pretzels and chips you can eat, right? But maybe
Right.
you're having like 2 chips and it's like, oh, that's amazing. And then you go back
Yep.
to like doing your thing. So the chips aren't really giving all that much, but it's like just that nice palate cleanser, right? So yeah, there are lots of different strategies and things we do to kind of, get us feeling good.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned that worked really well for me when I was sort of playing around with that stuff was your own internal like perceptions of some of these things, where I would notice, like, if I'm staying on top of fluids and I'm just not like, and I'm getting to that point where like I'm starting to crave salty foods and things like that, or the reverse, you mentioned this one earlier, where if I'm doing a little too much electrolytes, all of a sudden I'm like, I've been drinking plenty and I'm still thirsty. And I know I've been drinking enough. It's like, okay, I probably just need to peel back a little bit on the electrolytes and balance it out on the other end a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I guess maybe having enough variety in your race day fueling plan where you have those opportunities to test that. Or like when you go into an aid station, if your mind goes straight to the chips and pretzels because you're craving salt, then that's probably a good indication that maybe you'd benefit from a little bit more of that. So to some degree, you don't want to be overly reliant on your intuition, because we do have weird things going on when you've been out there for hours and hours on end. But in some cases you can as well with respect to that.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me, like even when I'm like, because I get samples of products all the time, and sometimes I'll taste them just in my kitchen, but I try to do it when I'm running, because I don't know about you, but things taste different when I'm running. Like a product that might taste really sweet in my kitchen tastes just right when I'm running. I'm like, ooh, delicious, refreshing, or maybe like after hours of something that was fun and different, it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna barf if I have this anymore. So it's important to kind of test things like that. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure we've all had that moment where we get to an aid station and we're just like, oh my God, chip or pretzel or whatever it is, M&M, like whatever the case may be, and just like, this is the best thing ever, So I think, like, even though, nothing new on race day, and yes, be careful about certain things, it's like, you can have like one little thing, and if that's just like tasting delicious to you, it's like, okay, great. But getting that kind of in the moment feedback and paying attention to your body is important. And really, like, when it all comes down to it, whether it's with your daily nutrition or intra-workout nutrition, we're always trying to balance kind of listening to our body and then more objectively thinking about our plan and what we know we need. Because we know that we can't just rely on thirst to meet our fluid goals, unless you're like a really light sweater, for the most part. We can't just rely on hunger to meet our energy needs, especially if you have really high energy needs. There will be times where you do have to eat even though you're not hungry, like after a really long workout. So it's just kind of constantly balancing that intuition and kind of listening to those cues, and then kind of rationally thinking about, like, what do I need to do in order to stick to my plan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it all makes sense. I think it's fun to be able to play around with this stuff too. It's like if you embrace the gamification of it, I think it gets a little more exciting. So
yeah, definitely.
I did want to ask you too about just like, from a gut training standpoint, there's like the actual exposure of having that amount of carbohydrates coming in and processing it. And there's also just like your gut's perception of how much is in there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any value in training that independent of just what you're going to get as a byproduct of taking in enough carbs and fluids and things during training? Like, is there things you could be doing either outside of training or during training to kind of stress test that, so that when you get to race day, all of a sudden what otherwise felt like kind of like a full uncomfortable stomach now feels a little more natural, a little more comfortable?
Do you mean like leaving yourself less time to digest, so you kind of like go into a workout more full, like that kind of thing?
That'd be an
what do you mean
example.
exactly?
Or like higher amounts of fluid, and or taking like a bigger bolus than you normally would on race day and training, just to stress test kind of the upper limit.
I mean, you certainly could. Like, sometimes when I have people do is, let's say they're doing like a short speed session. This is kind of also going back to what I was saying earlier, where I'm having a person doing a 2-hour session who doesn't necessarily, quote, need that much fueling during, but we're doing it anyways to practice gut training. So similarly, like, you know, if someone wants to work on fueling at a higher intensity, you know, can they take on something during an interval? Can they take on something while they're power hiking and working really hard climbing up a mountain? Like, you know, we can kind of get in moments where, or maybe when, if we know we're training for a really warm race and we're training in colder weather, and so we know we're going to have to tolerate more fluid, then potentially there could be some benefit in like, okay, cool, I am just going to replace more of my losses, even though I don't necessarily need them in this moment. I want to make sure my stomach can handle them. So yeah, I think there are particular cases where kind of stressing the gut a little bit more, as long as it's like a mild discomfort versus like I need to urgently run to the bathroom kind of feeling. You know, like yeah, or like the example I gave, like maybe you're just allowing a little bit less time to digest and you're running on a fuller stomach. You're practicing, what does it feel like if I have this cheese quesadilla or whatever I plan to eat in my ultra, and, you know, have that in my car and then immediately head out to the trailhead and do my run, you know? So yeah, I think you can practice those things as long as they make sense for you in terms of what you're doing. You know, don't like, obviously don't go do that if it's like, there's no reason to do it. Like, but I think there are some situations where that could make sense.
What about if it's just like, or maybe the question is like, is there any value in expanding your gut's actual volume capacity, like almost like a competitive eater would maybe do, I guess, in training?
Yeah. You know, I've read some research. Was it like one of the Asker J, what's this, I can never pronounce his last name. You know what I'm talking about. When he there was an older paper I remember reading, but it was talking about competitive eaters, because that's what we always, you know, reference, or often we're referencing with this stuff, is like, we see what happens with competitive eaters when they are practicing. Maybe they're chewing large amounts of gum, or they're eating more and more, and they're able to tolerate it with perceptions of less fullness. So we know that the gut can adapt to that. And so it's kind of thinking about, well, how does this translate to athletes? And so, I mean, kind of what I was saying earlier about just adequate amounts of carbohydrate affecting kind of our ability to absorb and oxidize carbohydrate, right? And then, yeah, greater volumes of fluid and kind of stretching out the gut can potentially lead to decreased kind of perception of fullness, potentially. Yeah, I mean, I think that could potentially be helpful. Beyond that, yeah, I don't have kind of anything on the tip of my tongue that I can share beyond that. I haven't done enough research on that, but yeah, I think I'm sure there are some benefits in some situations where that would matter for particular people.
Yeah, we're well into the realm of like theory and hypothetical at that point, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where, again, it really depends on who you are and what your goals are and what's your sport and all of that. I'd say, yeah, I mean, a lot of the times, like, I'm not even getting to that point with some of my athletes, because again, we're like, can you get in 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour consistently without pooping your pants? You know, it's like, we're kind of at that stage of things. Or can we get in consistent meals and snacks during the day? And so a lot of the times my efforts with people, and again, this is just my current population or my typical population of athletes, we're working on really those nutrition foundations and also the basics of intra-workout fueling. And then if we get there, we're kind of sprinkling a little bit of, you know, okay, great, let's look at caffeine, and maybe we're looking at other supplements, and kind of that, you know, the final cherry on top of supplementation and like performance enhancing supplements and such. But often it's like we're mostly focusing on the basics, because that's honestly not only where the biggest performance gains are, but also where most people need to work on.
Yeah, and if you nail the basics and you get to a point where you can play around in the margins, then that's a fun spot to be.
Perfect. That is a very fun spot to be. Yeah, exactly. I have yet to get someone who is nailing the basics and we're just working in the margins. Like, that never happens for my clients.
Even the basics need rehearsal, continual rehearsal.
Yeah. And hey, you know, and some people are like, I felt really good and now things have changed. My training goals have changed. And I mean, you're a great example too of like, something was working and now I want to explore something different because my goals have changed or I've evolved. So yeah, I mean, we're always constantly exploring this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of goes to what we were talking before. Even within the basics, there's enough like nuance and context within certain situations where the basics are applied differently here than they are there, and getting like you said, if you decide to do something different, like many people do, they don't always want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again with respect to like events and stuff like that, then they maybe have to relearn the basics in this context versus the one they were just in prior.
Totally.
Exogenous ketones have grown in popularity, and with that, lots of marketing and hype. Personally, I am most convinced by the cognitive support and performance benefits at lower intensity training sessions. There is an educational hurdle with these products, though, which is why I turn to Delta G Ketones, as they invest millions in research and education and have 70 plus clinical studies. They go the extra mile to help you get it right the first time, which is also why they offer a free consultation to help you better understand how your lifestyle can best be leveraged with this product. Head over to deltagketones.com and use promo code BITTER20 for 20% off. Details and links can be found in the show notes.
I had one other topic I wanted to chat with you about if you got time.
Yeah, I have plenty of time. We keep going.
Awesome. So it's interesting to me because like as the kind of endurance world sort of goes through this like high carbohydrate quest of trying to figure out where is the maximum amount we can get away with and still see performances at, and we're exploring a lot of that. The other side is kind of swinging hard against that with, okay, well, low carbohydrate performance is going to be something where it can yield a similar performance result, but with the context of fueling being like drastically on the other end, where we're getting to like recommendations of like, say 10 grams, not necessarily recommendations, but I guess the best way to maybe summarize this would be like the question we're trying to answer here is a blood sugar balance, which can be met with something as little as 10 grams per hour, which is obviously like drastically lower than what we'd be getting at when we're in the 60 to 90 plus gram range, or 30 to 90 plus gram range, dependent on the context of the situation. I mean, I got all sorts of thoughts about this. I was curious if you had looked at any of that and had any initial thoughts.
Yeah, so what you're referencing is the narrative review by Tim Noakes et al. And yeah, I mean, that was one of these papers that caused like the entire endurance world to like, not freak out, but there was a lot of response to it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so when it comes to blood sugar, and I have a whole episode on this with a dietitian who is a sports dietitian who works with diabetics as well, all about this issue. But yeah, people, first of all, you need to remember that like our blood sugar, like how we handle carbohydrate during and after exercise changes with exercise. So like, because part of this paper, and I will admit, I did not deep read. I told you this offline. I did not deep read all 53 pages of this paper. I like skimmed a few things. I looked at some overviews, and a colleague of mine did a really great kind of summary and pulled out some graphs, and I kind of glanced at that. But I got the gist, And the main claims, in case anyone hasn't looked at this narrative review, the main claims of this study is that basically we don't need to carb load, that you should follow low carb, high fat diet, and that you only need 10 grams per hour to fuel adequately, because it was basically talking about EIH, or exercise-induced hypoglycemia, and kind of what we need to do to prevent that. And then it was also kind of, I think one of the other claims was basically that high carbohydrate intake in healthy athletes will lead to diabetes, essentially, which is like an outrageous claim. Like it's really not something that happens very often. And so kind of what I want to say there is just a reminder, because all too often people are really scared of blood sugar spikes, and they have this kind of belief that we should just somehow be like flatlined with our blood sugar at all times. Like it should just be as even as possible. And really, like naturally, like our blood sugar should vary. It naturally varies. It should vary if we are healthy individuals without diabetes and insulin issues. Like we keep it very tightly regulated. It's not so much a problem. And then where exercise comes into play, because of course everyone's always worried about sugar, and yes, excess sugar outside of exercise in crazy amounts, all that, like yes, of course, like that has an impact on health. But keeping in mind, because often people are worried about sports nutrition products, and people come to me being like, I don't want to take so much added sugar, and I'm like, okay, so keep in mind that exercise improves insulin sensitivity, right? It changes basically how this all works. It changes glucose uptake. During exercise, basically the contracting muscles are has almost this like insulin-like effect. So, because like during exercise, insulin goes down because we're trying to prevent hypoglycemia from happening. And the muscles are able to more rapidly kind of take up glucose to be used by the cells. And this is all great. Like this is all a good thing so that we can kind of more quickly use the glucose we're taking in and that's available, and we can do the work that we're trying to do, et cetera, without kind of having these like raging, like people are worried that we're going to have these like crazy high blood sugar levels and all that. And that's not really what's happening during and also after exercise. So essentially those muscle cells are better able to use any available insulin in order to take up glucose. So there's kind of that. So I'm kind of reassuring people, and there's also a lasting effect after exercise. So some of our kind of sensitivity to all that and our ability to use and kind of absorb that glucose is changed just by exercising. So that's partly why, we really want to keep encouraging people to have these sources of glucose, right? That sugar isn't bad. You and I had this discussion of kind of good and bad and trying to avoid that terminology, and that can kind of get into not so great territory, and really recognizing that these products have their place. No one's saying like drink sports drink all day, go take gels with dinner. Like no one really wants to do that anyways, but they have a purpose. They have a very specific purpose. They're formulated in a very specific way. And yeah, this review paper, there's so much literature out there pointing towards the benefits of carbohydrate and, how, for events longer than 90 minutes, how carbohydrate loading, when done adequately, because I can't remember all the details off the top of my head, but I think maybe the study they pointed to, I could be wrong here, but maybe in that case, they weren't quite eating enough for their body weight. But there's good research to support that. When done adequately, you are eating enough carbohydrate, it can lead to a performance benefit of 2 to 3% for, again, these longer duration events. And, there's plenty of research also saying that the more carbohydrate you're taking in, there is a strong benefit to performance. And so yeah, this narrative review, which also I'll point out, so it was a study, but it's kind of a subjective interpretation of existing research. So it's not new research. It's like these people's interpretation of what's out there. And it basically has no inclusion or exclusion criteria like a meta-analysis would. And it doesn't really account for biases. And these authors are they're very well-known, low-carb, high-fat people are in that world. So we know these authors have biases. So yeah, we can go so many directions with this, but it didn't really serve to change my take on anything. It wasn't really, I know that's how most of my colleagues feel as well, other sports dietitians, kind of looking at the research that was presented. It kind of only sought to kind of underline what we all already believe, which is that carbs are beneficial and needed and not harmful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my biggest issue with it was mostly the communication around it. It was like, I agree. Well, there was issues within that I think was, there's communication within the actual review that was problematic, but then there was the communication that is like, here's this new study, blah, 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 that was even more egregious in my opinion. And the thing that, like, when you look at it, it's like, if we're going to make performance claims, like, first, let's give the people that we're trying to pair them with the actual recommendations of what they would be doing. And we're going to probably need to move into the world of highly pressurized sports at that point, competitive pressurized sports, to really get to the crux of some of this stuff. Because there's always going to be things we just don't know because we're not aware of it, or we don't have strong research on it that is going to find its way to the podium. And this is where I put this. It's like, it's one thing if we're making claims around sports that are like lower competitive pressure, less explored. But when we get into the world of like the marathon or the Tour de France and some of these events that have seen some insane amounts of competitive pressure, if someone's leaving that big of a thing on the table, like, someone's going to learn it, find out, and leverage it for their advantage. So like,
yeah,
like, why would the Tour de France athletes and the pro marathoners not be going 10 grams per hour if they could avoid all the logistical hurdles of fueling that high, avoid all the potential digestive issues that come along with it? It just would make a ton of sense for them to find that out and then leverage it and beat their competition as a result. So like, I think when you see that kind of communication come out where it's like, oh, this is like either there's no advantage to carb loading or there's no advantage to carb fueling. It's like it flies in the face of everything we've seen within the respect of the highest competitive pressure, right, sports. So if we want to have a conversation around like making calculated compromises for other purposes, or in a sport where we just don't have that information because it's not comparable enough to some of these other sports, that's one thing, but that's not really the communication I saw coming out of it. The way I saw it come out was basically like, oh yeah, you know, pro marathoners and Tour de France athletes are sending the wrong message because they're doing this the wrong way, or they're doing a way that could be done this other way. And it's just, you know, they're unaware of it.
Yeah. What I saw was just a lot of clickbait crap that was just like, everything we know about carbs is wrong. And it's like, what are you talking about? That like, no, like that's not true. It's like, it's like the research that existed like before this study came out. It's not like it just suddenly disappeared.
Right.
You know what I mean? And as you said, like we're literally watching so many people like just like throw down these insane performances consuming a lot of carbohydrate. And you know, like there's no like one size fits all diet. There's no one right way to do things. Like there is something where, and again, we talked about this too, where the research is pointing in a particular direction and we see the majority of people doing a certain thing, and there will always be outliers. There will always be outliers that are doing their thing, and there are anecdotal things coming out of like, this works great for me in this case. And, you know, and that's fine. You know, that's fine. At the end of the day, like you do whatever feels good for your body, you know, but where it becomes so problematic is, I think, where we see these studies that's basically telling people to have 10 grams of carb per hour, which is in my mind, flat out dangerous for for endurance athletes. That's not going to lead to a good place, especially when we think about energy availability.
Yeah, and I think the other argument around I always see is like it kind of ends up getting into this like world of these assumptions are made that are just not true, which is like, oh, these pro athletes are all going to get type 2 diabetes as a result of what they're doing now. And it's like I haven't seen that occur at any sort of alarming rate above and beyond what could be explained away by, here's a person who is eating 6,000 calories a day. They retired, stopped training, and continued to eat 6,000 calories a day.
Yeah,
and then they got type 2 diabetes. So
yeah. So I mean, again, you have to remember that endurance athletes, when we're thinking about the type of people who are consuming carbohydrate at this amount to match the amount of activity that they're doing, that's not the general population. We are not the general population as athletes. So it's the same thing when people are freaking out about sodium. People come to me like, oh my God, I saw we're supposed to do less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium and I consume so much sodium. I'm like, okay, well, unless you have hypertension, which I do get endurance athletes who have diagnosed hypertension or high cholesterol, all these different things, like, and we manage that, right? But like a healthy person without hypertension who's losing a lot of sodium, like we have to salt your food. We have to include sodium in, what you're drinking. Like, don't be afraid of these things. And remember that you are not like the average American who is maybe sedentary or whatever, like you're different. So you have to remember that sometimes the general guidelines for certain things just don't necessarily apply to you as much. And not to say, like, we do have to keep in mind like the basic tenets of like healthy eating, like, yes, having whole foods, having complex carbohydrates, going for, making sure you are having enough fiber to support a healthy gut, like all of that stuff, of course, it's so important. Like not going insanely high with added sugars outside of exercise. I always want people to enjoy their life and eat not just because it's fueling their activity and all that, but also because it's pleasurable and they use it to connect with people. Like food is about so many things. So yeah, like have a dessert, have this and that. It's not like you can only have sugar surrounding exercise and that's the only time. Like have it when you want it, but also be sure you're prioritizing like fruits and starchy veggies and whole grains and like all that good stuff. So, I think this is where it's like all the boring, non-sexy nutrition advice comes into play. And then, so we have to kind of keep that around. And then the intra-workout stuff where, yeah, like immediately before, during, and after, we aren't prioritizing high fiber carbohydrate. We want like easier to absorb, like quickly absorbable carbohydrates immediately after a long run or a really hard session to help replenish glycogen stores. Same with before, to prevent GI issues and just kind of get that fast acting glucose in. So yeah, there's a time and a place for everything. I think that's kind of the bottom line. And, we don't need kind of this fear mongering towards carbohydrate, which, I mean, it's just everywhere, or truly towards anything. It really is not helpful.
Perfect. Well, Claire, I don't want to keep you around too much longer. It was a blast to have you on and chat. I'm sure I'll have some follow-up questions for you at some point if you're ever interested in coming back on and chatting.
I am happy to come on anytime.
Awesome. Well, before I let you go, do you mind letting the listeners know where they can find you, social media, website, where they can reach you and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm pretty consistent with my branding. I'm Eat for Endurance everywhere. So you can find me on Instagram. That's where I'm most active, although love-hate relationship with Instagram. I go in ebb and flow with my content production there, I will say. My website is eatforendurance.com. Yeah, I do one-to-one counseling. I have a really awesome membership as well. If anyone wants to reach out, I would love to hear.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.